On this episode of Mental Makeover Radio, I sit down with my friend Laura Beaver, who's a licensed clinical social worker from Texas. Laura is so insightful, and it was such a great conversation. We talk all the things about trauma, addictions, and grief and loss. Laura specializes in working with people and family members of those who've been impacted by trauma and addictions. And we dive deep into what is trauma? How do we work with it? And the ways in which we numb our emotions on a daily basis, starting from something as simple as maybe online shopping and how that escalates into drug abuse and alcoholism, and then how that ties into lots of grief and loss. It is such a rich conversation. I'm really excited to share this with you. And I'm really looking forward to feedback that you might have about this conversation, what you think about it, and how you've been impacted by it. Sit back and tune into this. Some of this might be a little bit hard, it might be a bit challenging, but you know what? Growth always comes from a place of discomfort. So I'm really glad you're here, and let's get ready for a mental makeover. Welcome to Mental Makeover Radio, your go-to destination for meaningful conversations about mental health. I'm your host and your trusted therapist bestie, Cecilia Mannella. Join us as we explore the complexities and messiness of human experience by addressing your questions and concerns. I'm here to provide a straightforward and practical therapy advice. So grab your favorite beverage, whether it's tea, coffee, or whatever tickles your taste buds, and get ready to embark on a mental makeover. Hello and welcome to Mental Makeover Radio. I'm your host, Cecilia Mannella, and I am joined by my friend, Laura Beaver, who is a therapist and amazing human being. And we have recently met through a business mastermind, and Laura is, multi-talented in many ways, but loves to talk a lot about addiction. So we're going to talk about substance use and addiction and family members and how to navigate that. It's going to be a great conversation. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here today.
So happy to have you here. So let's start with, how did you get here? Like, what is the path? Who was little Laura? How did you end up in therapy? What are all the roads and the little side streets that you took to get here?
Yeah. So, when I was in high school, I took a career, one of those tests. It's like, figure out what you should be. And I remember just being so adamant, like, I am not going to sit behind a desk all day. And so every question I answered, was in that vein, and it told me I should be a magician.
A magician?
Yeah. I was like, I don't even know why that was an option.
I'm like, how is that even an option on a career aptitude test? I love it.
Yeah. So that wasn't my path though. So when I went to college, I went to orientation and you had to pick a major. And so I was like, well, I picked sociology because I had taken a sociology class in high school and I thought it was really interesting. And my mom was like, you will never get a job with a sociology degree. Please just major in social work. And that was the time that I also found out that my mom, who I had only ever known her to be a teacher, a fifth grade teacher, had been a social worker way before she had, there's a big age gap between my siblings and I. So before she had my brother and sister, she'd been a social worker. And I didn't know that until that moment in time. And so I was like, fine, I'll major in social work, whatever, like not really thinking about it. And I'm just one of those lucky people that like, it was such a good fit for me. And I absolutely loved it from the very first class I took and have been in that field ever since that day at orientation. So when I graduated my master's degree, I was very adamant, like, I will never do therapy. I have no desire to do clinical work. I thought like community work, macro, big picture stuff was really interesting to me. And so I went down that road for a little bit, but I missed clients. And so after a brief stint in grant writing, I went back to client work. But then when I started to have kids, I was actually offered a full-time teaching position at a university. And so I spent a little over 8 years doing full-time work, teaching and running field education stuff or like internships for those not in the field. And loved that work. But we had a huge life shift a little over 2 years ago where I really realized higher ed was not where I wanted to be long term. And at the same time, our family was moving, and it was just like the perfect time to jump the higher ed ship and into the waters of therapy. So a part of my job was I helped run a center against human trafficking and exploitation. And a lot of what I did was train people on what trauma is, what it looks like, what research says about it. And so I had a huge investment in trauma because of that piece of my job. And so when I went into working with clients again, I knew that trauma was a big piece of what I wanted to do. But since then, I've also learned a lot about what that entails. And a lot of it really can be, there's a huge piece of loss with trauma. So the place I work now, we specialize in trauma, grief, and loss. And so the saying we have is like, all trauma comes with loss, but not all grief comes with trauma. Right. So I work more on the trauma side. And a lot of what we see too is just how addiction plays a huge role in trauma, and how addiction plays a huge role in loss and grief as well. And so that's a little bit of kind of like how I got here and why I'm doing therapy now. And I love it. I never thought I would be doing this at this point in my life, but I love it. And I've learned never say never, that little baby graduate student that was like, therapy, no way. So yeah, I'm here and I love it. And I love working with the people I get to work with every day.
Oh, I love it. We have a very similar path. I never knew this. So I fell into social work after trying other things like psych and crim and sociology, and was loving all the things. I'm like, how am I going to get a job doing these things? You can't get a job doing this. And then I just happened to take like a social work kind of like intro class. And I had this feeling of like, oh, these are my people. Like, this is the homecoming experience of like, this is where I fit. This makes sense. It's like integrates all those pieces into one, but also, there's a job at the end, which I thought was really fantastic. And I really just thought I was going to do 2 years. And I was like, oh, there's no way I'm going to do more than my diploma. And then I got there. I'm like, oh, I could do 2 more years. And then I got to my degree. I'm like, I'm never going to do a master's degree. That thing's ridiculous. That's way too much time and money. And then I got to the end. I'm like, oh, I could probably do that. And then I never thought I'd do therapy either, like at all. I was community based. I was doing a lot of trauma work, working with survivors of sexual abuse, pretty much solely only doing sexual abuse survivor work, and loved it and thought like, I'm a grassroots girl. Like, I want to be boots to the ground. I don't want to be stuck in a desk or an office. I also then started teaching and really enjoyed it. I did it for about 12 years. In the midst of that, kind of doing other things. And I thought, therapy might be my thing. And I went into it and I loved it. Mm-hmm. So it's really funny how sometimes we get really stuck on what we think something's going to be. And it really doesn't turn out to be that way, that we have to be open to other opportunities.
Yeah.
I love that. And also have a strong like trauma background. So tell me about, there's so much to talk about here. Tell me about your perspective of how you understand trauma, how you explain it to people, so listeners have an idea of kind of the trauma approach or trauma education.
Yeah. So the perspective that I personally come from in the work that I do is that all of us have a protective system. So at the end of the day, our brains really care about us surviving and, for lack of better terms, like being comfortable. So we want to avoid pain.
100%.
We want to avoid emotions that we don't like or situations that feel uncomfortable. But then there's also that big safety component. And so when trauma happens, especially if you think of like a child, right? Like, and things that we might look back on with our adult perspective and think, well, that wasn't traumatic. But in that moment as a child, something happened to us where our brain thought, I never want to feel this way again, or I never want that to ever happen to me again. And so there is, the saying is like trauma is in the eye of the beholder. So there are the things that we think of as like classic trauma pieces of emotional, physical, sexual abuse, a lot of neglect, and pieces like that come, or like a major traumatic loss or something like that. Like those definitely are trauma. But sometimes there's other things too, like, you know, being called on in class and not knowing the answer. For some kids, that is such an experience that their brain stores it as trauma. And when that happens, the brain does everything humanly possible to avoid that situation again or that feeling or emotion again. And that's where your protective system comes online. And it's saying, okay, I'm going to be like the best student in the class, like, so that this will never happen to me again. Or maybe I'm going to like disconnect and totally avoid. So I can just be kind of numb to what's going on. There's lots of different ways that our systems do that. And so oftentimes, like if we want our thoughts and our emotions and all of that, we want it to be this like smoothly flowing stream, but trauma creates these little whirlpools where our brain gets stuck. And it's like, there's the rumination, there's the avoidance, there's all the things that your protective system's doing because it's caught up in that whirlpool. So I think of trauma work is just like trying to smooth that back out for people. And there's a variety of different ways we can do it, but it's a lot less about, I think sometimes a lot of what we see in the mental health world is like changing behavior, because usually there's some sort of behavior going on that isn't serving us anymore. And that's part of our protective system, usually has some behaviors that worked really well for us as kids, but as adults, it's not working for us anymore. And it's not just behavior change. I look at like, what can we do with the brain so that we're not having these whirlpools anymore? We're smoothing them out, which will inevitably change behavior. But the perspective I come from isn't necessarily just like targeted at behavior change. It's more, root ground up type work. That is, unfortunately, the nature of deeper work is it takes a little longer and it takes a little more patience. But, I think that ultimately it's moving more far beyond than just like a simple behavior change.
Yeah. And like, I don't think simple behavior changes work, or else you and I would not have jobs. Like, that's just the reality. So it's really funny and like ironic to me when there's this expectation, if I just stop doing this thing. So if I just stop smoking, drinking, gambling, or, acting out, or, lose my temper or slam doors, like we so focus on the behavior. If I just stop doing this thing, then everything else will be fine. And it's like, well, if that was just that simple, then everyone would just do it, because behavioral changes are not that difficult. Whether I want to, drink coffee today or decide like, oh, I'm going to stop drinking coffee this morning and I'm going to have coffee by noon. Like that's fairly easy to do. We have a lot of autonomy. We have a lot of choices. And I think the piece that most people miss is that when it's rooted in trauma, it's not that simple. Yet we try to talk about it as if it's that simple without realizing that it does have roots. And you can, if anyone's gardens, right? Like you can pull a weed by like all day long. You'll be pulling it every single week, unless you like really get down and figure out what that root actually really is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Which requires a little patience in this culture of instant gratification, right? Like I have a lot of people who come into therapy like, okay, so how long is this going to take? And it's like, I have no idea. Like, I don't, there's no like magic 5-step rule that I'm following here that I can tell you it's going to take this much time. It's a process that people have to be engaged in and be willing to pull that root out, which requires a lot of vulnerability, which requires maybe feeling really uncomfortable, and maybe not even liking what they find or what they find out and what they discover. Like you said, if it's tied to a school event, which seems really simple or silly, when you look back as an adult, that's uncomfortably like, that's what this is about. Like, that seems dumb, but that might be the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about like substance use and addiction and grief and how that all kind of mixes itself out. Because again, I think we have this culturally have this this viewpoint. We say things like, or I hear people say, just stop doing that. Why can't they get their shit together? Just like go to rehab and figure it out. Why is this so hard? We still very much live in a culture of a lot of judginess and looking down on any kind of substance use.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and it's so interesting because talk about like a place where people think it's just a behavior change.
Right. Like,
Um,
just stop using the crack. It's got to be that simple. It's like, if it
yeah.
was, they would do it. Like, if it was, they would do it. It's the same thing with smoking. Just quit smoking. It's like, well, if it was that easy, they would do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I love coming at addictions from a depathologizing perspective
Okay, explain what that
because,
means.
yeah.
I
So,
know what that means, but
yeah. So, and just so you know, a lot of the foundations of where I'm coming from is from something called internal family systems or
Mhm.
IFS work or parts work. And so I'll kind of explain that as I talk. But so often with behaviors that we think are causing problems or we want to like any sort of substance use, like the idea is like make it go away, change the
Right.
behavior, make it go away. Or you think about anxiety, like someone that comes in is like, I just have all this anxiety. They want it to go away, which is fair. Like we don't want the behaviors that are coming out are not always healthy and good, right?
Right.
So the saying in IFS is all parts of us are welcome, but not all behaviors are
Right.
okay. And so when I talk about it being depathologizing, the whole goal is to figure out what I'll take substance use. So like what is using that substance doing for you? It's
Right.
doing something for your system. It's helping you for most people, it's a part that is able to pull them out of the present reality so that they are feeling numb or they're feeling euphoria or something to where they don't have to feel what's actually going on in that moment. Because whatever it is, their brain has decided this is too painful for me to handle or this is too uncomfortable. And all their other parts that have been trying to manage that, something's like, uh-oh, this isn't working.
Right.
We need to have a drink
Right.
or we need to have a cigarette or whatever.
Mhm.
And so when you think of it as less of a you're doing something wrong, because right, like it is very much like a substance use in general is really viewed as like almost like a moral failure of you as a person,
Like somehow you're
right?
not strong enough.
Yeah.
It's
But the reality is like, no, that person's protective system has found a really good way, like a really, really effective and really good way for them to get pulled out of what is happening right now in the present so that they don't have to feel it because for them, their system has said, this is too much and we can't handle this. We have to have a way to protect ourselves from feeling
something.
this way.
Yeah, and when
Um,
I always stand with, and I wonder if you agree, is like we all do behaviors that are numbing.
mhm.
Like we all do it. It's like sex, food, TV, scrolling on social media. It's substances, smoking, drinking, shopping, gossiping. Like we all engage in behavior that shifts how we're feeling because we don't enjoy what the feeling is, whether the feeling is loneliness or sadness or discomfort or grief or disappointment or whatever it is that we're feeling. We don't want to feel that. And so we will pick something to numb. And when we talk about substance use, I think that sometimes we forget that someone's need to shop on Amazon every single day to get a delivery is no different. That dopamine hit, that behavior of shifting my emotion is really no different than someone who's potentially using crack.
Yeah. Yes. And I think, it's it's more socially acceptable to go order something on Amazon. Like
Of course.
that's where the big difference comes
Right.
in. And so a lot of too, kind of what we see is oftentimes the best course of action for people is to go to some sort of treatment facility
Right.
where whether it's for gambling or pornography or sex addiction or substances, like any form of addiction like that. And they get treatment, which is great, right? They're having some clarity, they're getting some space, some sobriety from it. But so much is going on for them and for their loved ones and family that are left behind by that
Right.
process that they come home trying to reintegrate into this new world, and they've lost something that they needed to lose, perhaps, right? Like, we need
Sure.
to lose this behavior, but they also probably lost a lot in that process of that behavior taking over and getting to that point. But then you have the loved ones in the family that have been just oftentimes with treatment facilities, like, largely ignored, and what they need, and holding everything together while that person is in treatment.
Right.
And it can become this kind of like, the reintegration piece is really where a lot of parts come up.
Right.
And so there is kind of like this cycle that we see, or this, the like, so I'm trying to think of like the right words to use. So with someone that has been using, for example, or has an addiction, they probably have what we call managers. So managers are parts of us that are part of our protective system that are constantly going all the time. So
Right.
they're constantly trying to like keep us from all sorts of things that don't feel right for our system. Anxiety is a great example, like that just sort of like constant sort of anxious part of us that's like, what about this? What about that? It could be an inner critic part that's like constantly criticizing you, trying to get you to do something. Sometimes they're really productive parts. They can push us towards productivity or being organized or giving us a
Right.
sense of control over things.
Right.
But oftentimes what happens for people that are dealing with substance use is those managers are working really hard, but it's the system is like, but it's not doing a good enough job because stuff is still creeping in, right?
Because we're still having those emotions. We're still having those
Yes.
feelings.
And this
Right.
happens a lot with trauma because it doesn't always have to make sense. It could be just because our bodies hold so much of this too, that our body is like communicating to the brain, like, uh-oh, something feels similar, or something seems similar, or this emotion is creeping in, to where a firefighter, so an example of like an addiction, a firefighter is a part that's like, manager is not doing a good enough job. I need to pull you out of this moment right now so that our system does not get overloaded and collapse,
Right.
or that we're not unsafe.
Right.
So for a lot of people, that is some sort of substance or addictive thing, and it does a great job. So they come out of treatment, and, well, let me back up. On the backside of that is the shame and guilt, right? So, oh my gosh, I used again. I'm not going to do it again. Or
Right.
like the kind of,
Now I see how much I've hurt people, like the devastation that addiction has created. There's this, because in the abstinence of not having that, as you say, firefighter, that substance, whatever that behavior is to relieve, you can see with some clarity. And there is a lot of guilt and shame, and there's a lot of promises or things that get said, like, I will never do this again. And that is,
yes.
but it's cocooned in safety. Treatment is wonderful, like, for so many reasons, but it is a cocoon of safety where you're surrounded by people all the time. There's always someone there to talk to if you're feeling that elevation of emotion, or that trauma's kind of peeking through. There's someone there to process with it, sit with you with it. It's not real life, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's this beautiful cocoon that allows you to get some clarity, but in that, it doesn't really mimic what happens in the real world.
Yes. And shame and guilt are two emotions that are really elicit a firefighter because, I mean, when you feel shame, you want something quickly. I think shame, guilt, and embarrassment are like the three worst emotions that I find firefighter behavior comes from, because those are just so difficult for our system to feel. So, right, they come out of that cocoon of safety. There's a deep sense of loss. There might be a deep sense of shame and guilt that comes with it, and they're trying to reintegrate into their family. Meanwhile, their loved ones have been through their own process of, okay, their managers were probably trying to control that person and their behavior, or enable them. Because sometimes you manage by enabling. That's part of the cycle. And so
Yeah, and let's
now,
talk about enabling before we move on a little bit,
yeah.
because I think that a lot of, I think we have this vision that enablers are the problem. And because we often talk about it like that, you're enabling, and we point fingers, like, you're such an enabler, and it becomes like this label. But let's talk about like what enabling actually really is. Like, what's your perspective on enabling?
I think it's a word that has a negative connotation that it actually is. If you think about it, the reason that enabling behavior exists is because it works and it makes our system feel really at ease in a really crazy situation, right? So if I am
100%.
enabling behavior, it helps me feel like, well, if they're going to use, I'm in control of that somehow, right? Like,
Mhm.
um,
Or I
I,
can keep the kids safe,
yes,
right? Like
yeah,
if I just buffer this and I manage it somehow, then I can keep the kids safe. I can keep the dog safe. I can keep, mom safe.
yeah,
I can keep some sort of sense of safety if I can just buffer the situation just enough that
yes,
everybody else is going to be okay. And so you're right, like enabling does have this like negative reputation, let's say, but really it is about trying to keep as many people safe as possible.
yeah. It
Mhm.
has a really strong protective quality to it. That
Mhm.
the flip side of it is that it's it it's helping the other behavior continue. But
Right.
when we do that, when people have enabling, when they are enabling, it's because there's a part in them that is saying, I have to have some sense of safety in this situation,
Right.
and this is how I can do it. And so it's
Right.
just them trying to also protect themselves. So you can see how in these relationships, okay, my system's trying to protect me, my loved one's system's trying to protect them, and we're just kind of in this dance, so to speak, of like our parts interacting in that way. And so oftentimes after treatment too, the the that that protective piece is still there, and it's probably very active because it's unsure of how things are going to go. And what we see from a firefighter perspective from loved ones is because of the deep sense of grief and loss, you can have anger outbursts, or think of a firefighter trying to pull them out of the feeling of betrayal that they might feel, or the deep sense of loss that
Right.
they're feeling. And that can come out in anger or emotional shutdown or other types of like panic attacks, right? Like something seems like they might be using again, and then you might have like a full-on panic attack about it because that's just your firefighter protective system saying, uh-oh, we can't
Right.
be here right now. And so with all of that, I think that um, we miss so much of, okay, if the behavior isn't there, great, but it doesn't mean that the person's system isn't still feeling all of those same things, right? So that's why you have to really work with, whether it's the person that went through treatment or the loved ones, like, what is your system responding to right now? And how can we work with it to help create some understanding and some compassion, connectedness to it, so that you are aware of like, okay, like I'm feeling this way right now, but my system is trying to protect me from that. Okay, like that's such a shift when I know, like, I'm angry because I am in so much pain from everything that has happened. My system's trying to protect me from feeling that
Right.
pain. That's a huge shift. I mean, imagine the conversations that can happen in a family if two people could have a conversation around that, in their healing process. So yeah, that's a lot. But I think the whole picture I'm trying to
Mhm.
paint is like, our systems are all trying to help us in some way, and we have to try to get to what is the root. It's like looking at something, like, gosh, I'm going to date myself, but I don't know if you ever had those like magic eye posters as a kid where you like, it's like a pattern and you had to stare at it and eventually you
Yes.
would see this picture.
Yes.
And it's kind of like that. Like,
Yes.
you got to
Yes.
look at it and be curious about it for long enough to where it's like, oh, and oftentimes, like, the work we do in session is a lot of internal dialogue, and your brain knows. It knows exactly what's going on. You just got to be patient enough to hear it and open enough to hear it as well. And it's a really neat thing to see when it
Yeah,
happens.
it is. Yeah, we get so rooted in one way. right? Like we get rooted in, you do IFS, I do a lot of narrative. It's very similar, but we talk a lot about like, this dominant story or dominant script that we constantly have. And we get, and everyone has it, and every relationship has it. We have this dance, and you do A, and then I do B, and then when I do B, you do C, and then we just kind of
Mhm.
do this thing back and forth. It's like playing tennis back and forth. It's the same thing over and over again, and it's a really well rehearsed. It's predictable. It's familiar. It's comfortable because it's familiar, but not comfortable because it feels good. It's, and changing all of that is actually really hard. And I think that we try to oversimplify it, and then people feel shameful when it doesn't work. They kind of like get really mad at themselves, or somehow they've failed, and without looking at it like, well, this is just a really hard thing to change, and you can't just magically change it because you decide to. Like, it takes a lot of active work to recreate new relationships with each other, but new relationships with yourself, like you say, like these parts of you, like to change how that happens takes a lot of work. And then that interacts with other people, that also takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
So it's not a shaming experience. It needs to be a bit more compassion and a bit more open, so
Yeah.
that there's an understanding that we're human. I always say, like, we're just humans. We're just messy. Like, we're just these emotional organisms that really happen to think. Like, we're all about responding to emotions first, and then the thought process comes later, right? So, and if we had a little bit more patience, it might be a little bit easier.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you touched on that. Like, one of the big pieces of IFS is that we all have this source of self energy within us, that oftentimes these parts cloud to where we can't access that. But what can be so scary, I think, about therapy is, in a culture where we are taught to run from pain, therapy actually asks us to look directly at it. And that's really scary.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's, and
I
actually
love that.
not just look at it, but move towards it, right? Like,
Move towards that. Like, and
yeah,
sit in it. Like, sit in the pool
yes,
of it and like muck around and play with it, right? In the sense of,
yes,
instead of trying to avoid it as much as possible. Because you're right, we live in a time, in a culture, we're inundated with 1,000 millions of different ways to avoid pain.
yes. And what I find is when people can harness that self energy, so the qualities that we say is, I'm going to forget them all, but it's creativity, connectedness, calm, clarity, compassion, courage. There's a couple more C's. They're all C's. But when we feel those qualities, that is when it's so amazing to me. It's when you move towards the pain with those qualities, it's so freeing. And it's actually not that it's not painful, but it's almost like such a release that I find, for the people I work with, that like, oh, because I walked towards my pain and I had this energy with me when I did, it wasn't as scary as my protective system thought it would be. Like, I actually had something in me that was able to handle it, that was able to tolerate it. And it's a really freeing process when people can get to that place too.
Walking towards a pain. I mean, the Buddhists say, suffering is a choice, in the sense of our suffering comes from avoiding pain. The pain is
Mm-hmm.
inevitable, and suffering is a choice. Because
Mm-hmm.
in our avoidance of that painful experience is actually where suffering exists. And some of this is getting back to basics around, I was trying to remind people, like, we are built for this. Like, we don't have, so, like, we're built for love, right? And most people can agree with that. It's like, you have a baby, we don't have to teach children how to love. They just love. They're just like, that's what they are. We don't have to teach them to be curious. They're just curious. They just are. So all these things are innate in who we are. But the experience of pain is also built for us. Someone falls off their bike and they cry, and it's like, oh, that's a really painful experience. Like, pain is also part of, like, we're built to know how to do it. Like, we're built to be able to feel it, to withstand it, to get through it, to get to the side. And it's when we interrupt that experience of pain, when we say, it's okay, don't cry, it's not a big deal, or you're like, when we go to that place of trying to take the pain away and rationalize it, create stories around it, or to minimize it, that's actually where the problem starts to happen. It's not the
Yeah.
pain itself. It's what we
Yeah.
do to somehow avoid that pain. And we teach kids how to do this. So it's not okay to feel this. It's not okay to feel that. I got to put a smile on my face and like pretend everything's okay. And that is like the birthplace of pretty much all the problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is the avoidance of how we actually feel. And that's when, like you said, that manager shows up and goes, okay, so that's not okay. Now I've learned that this experience is actually not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to do whatever it is to hide it, to pretend it never happened, to avoid it, to numb it, to do whatever it is from that experience. But we are built for it. Like humans are really good at it.
Yeah.
We're super adaptive.
Yes. And you know what's so funny is I have a couple of children's books that I like will read or reference with clients all the time because it's like we want to teach it to children, but then we can't like actually watch it happen, as the adults. We're like, oh wait, I can't handle that for you. But the one I love that is, I don't know if you know, like it's going on a bear hunt. And it's like, we're going on a bear hunt. We're going to catch. Okay. So the whole premise of the book is like this family, they're going to go on a bear hunt. They're going to catch a big one. It just repeats over and over again, but they come into all these obstacles along the way. And so it's like, oh, this field, well, we can't go over it. We can't go under it. We have to go through it. And then it comes to like a river. Oh, we can't go over it. We can't go under it. We have to go through it. And over and over again until they find this bear. But I love that book so much because I'm like, here it is right here. Like, how often do we come up to things that we're like, oh, this is not going to be fun. And we want to go around it or over it or under it. But like the reality is you just got to go through it. And I sometimes think children's books actually send the message that we want to have. We're just not always great at like carrying it out in action in real life. But yeah, that's one that I reference on that topic
maybe
all the time.
Maybe all of us should be reading these children's books instead of scrolling on our phones.
Yeah.
And just along that line too, because I know you work a lot with grief, is like, it's also like we are built for grief.
Mm-hmm.
Like grief isn't a abnormal human experience. It's actually a very normal, expected human experiance.
Yes. And I think the challenge that the challenge we see culturally so much is we want solutions. We want to avoid the pain, right? And grief of all of the things is the most unpredictable, but also the one that nobody knows what to do with. And so oftentimes others avoid people, I think culturally there's a lot of like, something happens and probably just look at American bereavement policies in the workplace, probably sum it up pretty well. Like, okay, you can have a day for the funeral, but then I need you back here moving on with your life. There is sort of this expectation of like, this thing happened, you got your day, now you need to move on. And because we don't know how to fix it, you can't fix grief. There's no behavior change. You can't do a behavior change model for grief. You have to go through it. And because of the nature of it, I think, and oftentimes the unpredictability of it, the longevity of it, it is one that is oftentimes people try to avoid the most, either others around you or even ourselves internally, of like trying everything else, but actually feeling the grief. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, come to see the avoidance of grief is, creates a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Creates a lot of anxiety. It just creates a lot of things instead of just embracing it. It's like we're so terrified to feel loss when it's like, well, we're built for it.
Yeah.
So like,
the thing I hear and I think the thing I hear the most is, I'm afraid it will never stop. Like if I enter into,
Mm.
that's one of the fears oftentimes with like
I
parts
hear
that
that all the
carry
time. Yeah.
a lot of sadness and grief is like, but if I go there, it will never stop, or I will
Never stop.
never
Yeah.
get out of
Never.
this. It's a huge
Or I'll
fear of
never stop
ours.
crying. If I
Yeah.
start crying, I'm never going to stop. It's like, well, that's not physiologically possible. So, like, your body's not going to let you do it
Yeah.
ever. Like,
Yeah.
I've never known anyone to start crying and not stop crying. Like, that's just not a thing. So, it is a lot of fear around the depth of it, in that
Hmm.
and in our avoidance of it is actually when we start to look for easy solutions that become behaviors that we don't really want to have in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
Yeah. And that grief is attached to everything, like any minute little change. Like we go back to like when someone in the family changes, there's grief attached to that. When their behavior changes, there's some grief attached to that. It's a version of a life you had that you no longer have, or it's a version of your
Yeah.
future that you're not going to have anymore. It doesn't have to always be attached to, the loss of a human or death of someone you love. It can be the loss of a life you thought you would have,
Yeah. Yes.
or a past that you thought you'd have too. I have a lot of people that come to therapy and they realize they're like, oh, my childhood was fine. And then they realize my childhood was totally fucked up. Like, I don't even understand how I didn't know this before. And then they experience this great grief, right? And you're like, yes, because you're grieving the loss of a childhood you thought you had, but now with a new lens, you can see it actually
Yes.
wasn't safe. It wasn't loving. It wasn't protective in the way that you thought it was, or that you kind of had to tell yourself it was in order to survive it. And so there's loss attached to that, grief attached to that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So true.
Right. So true. Laura, where can people find you?
So
And I have a bit of a freebie. So what's your freebie you're giving
yeah,
away to the
so I have
listeners?
a free workbook for everyone if you're interested.
Great.
Looking through, addiction through that IFS lens.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be a link to that where you can just go and
Mm-hmm.
download it. So that's a great resource. You can find me on Instagram and the world. I almost said the World Wide Web, like it's 1990.
Talk about dating ourselves. We're like making 90s references. Everyone now knows how old we are. What's your Instagram handle?
So my Instagram handle is Courage and Community. And then my website is just couragecommunity.co. And then the practice I work for is based out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas, and it's called Oak and Willow Counseling. So feel free to
Laura,
connect.
this was everyone connect with Laura. Get the workbook. It's going to be great. Laura, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and having this conversation.
Yeah,
so great.
Thanks so much for having me.